market economy, sociocultural preconditions, and economic requirements. Fraud, corruption, monopoly, and other market failures do not disappear with wave of a magic neoclassical world. A well-functioning market system depends on at least the following 12 market facilitating legal and economic practices. 1. Property rights clearly established and demarcated procedures for establishing property rights and transferring them. Number 2. Commercial laws and an independent judiciary to enforce them, especially contract and bankruptcy laws. Number 3. Freedom to establish business in all sectors, except those with significant externalities without excessive licensing requirements, analogous freedom to enter trades and professions, and to attain government offices, which is equal economic opportunity. Number 4, a stable currency and banking system, including a reliable and efficient system for making transfers. Number 5, public supervision or operation of natural monopolies, which is industries with increasing returns to scale, as occurs in industries where technological efficiency requires that a firm be large enough to supply a substantial fraction of the national market. Number 6, provision of adequate information in every market about the characteristics of the product offered and the state of supply and demand to both buyers and sellers. Number 7, autonomous taste protection of consumers' preference from influence by producers and purveyors. Number 8, public management of externalities, both harmful and beneficial, and provision of public goods. Number 9, instruments for executing stabilizing monetary and fiscal policies. Number 10, safety nets or provisions for maintaining adequate consumption for individuals affected by certain economic misfortunes, especially involuntary unemployment, industrial injuries, and work disabilities. Number 11, encouragement of innovation, in particular issuance and enforcement of patents and copyrights. And lastly, security from violence, which is the most basic of all social foundations. It is clear that market reforms involve much more than merely eliminating price distortions, privatizing public enterprises, and declaring markets free. The setbacks to market reforms in many transition economies is in no small measure attributable in the absence of some or many of the institutional preconditions and market practices. Thus, governments have important limits and so do markets, as the early review of market failures makes clear. Again, the question is one of balance. This is reflected in the move away from the once dominant Washington Consensus. Next topic is the Washington Consensus on the role of the state in development and its subsequent evolution. For much of the 1980s and into the 1990s, the so-called Washington Consensus on development policy held sway. This consensus, encapsulated by John Williamson, reflected on the free market approach to development followed in those years by the IMF, World Bank, and key U.S. government agencies, along with some other developed countries at the time. It contains 10 points, and its 10 points are striking at least as much for what they do not contains as for what they do. There is no mention of shared growth, of the central need to focus on eliminating absolute poverty to achieve development in any meaningful sense, or of reducing inequality as central ends in themselves as well as instruments of economic growth. Indeed, as Danny Roderick summarizes in Box 11.1 For about half of its elements, the Washington Consensus is at best of toward new consensus. In recent years, major changes in the Washington Consensus worldview have occurred in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. In the Americas, the new views were sometimes referred as the New Consensus, which began to take shape at the April 1998 Summit of the Americas in Santiago, Chile. Other important contributions to attempts to describe an expanded and more balanced consensus, albeit with focus solely on growth rather than broader human development, include the Commission on Growth and Development's 2008 Growth Report Strategies for Sustained Growth and Inclusive Development, commonly referred to as the Spence Report, and the broader scope suggested by Danny Roderick. A final example, including infrastructure and industrialization, was articulated in the 2010 Seoul G20 communique. Note that the scholarly tradition in Europe and Japan, as well as in many parts of the developing world, such as India, has remained more positive toward the role of the state throughout the period, but has to a large degree also converged toward the new consensus. The new consensus view represents in part a renewed recognition that markets do fail, that at times these failures cannot be addressed without a significant and ongoing role for government, that market failure can be significantly worse than government failure after all, and that when government is poor, it can be often be improved. Indeed, a key part of government's role is to help secure the foundation for economic development by ensuring that the requirements for an effective market-based economy are met. Development political economy. Theories of policy formulation and reform. Until recently, two extreme views seem often to have dominated the discussion of the role of government in economic development. The first view has been that effective government was not only necessary due to market failure, but possibly even sufficient to achieve economic development. At least implicit in this view is the argument that if a particular regime could not be counted on to perform competently and honestly in this process, either the regime would eventually be forced to do so as a result of building political pressures, or else it would lose power through elections if available or through other means if not. The second view, associated with the neoclassical counter-revolution or the New Orthodoxy school, which has its roots in Nobel laureate Friedrich von Hayek and was developed in the ideas of Nobel laureate James Buchanan and was viewed or applied to development policy by Anne Krieger, Deepak Lal, and others. In this view, participants in governments, such as politicians and bureaucrats, were as selfish and self-interested as owners of companies in a poverty trap. Government itself played a key role in that bad equilibrium. While these points might enjoy broad agreement under some circumstances, this approach drew the strong conclusion that, as a rule, at least beyond a minimum role, governments could only make things worse. Understanding voting patterns on policy reforms. Sometimes, reform is designed to maximize the benefits of the few. It is natural that the majority would oppose this if they have the power to do so, or they may think it likely that they will lose in the process of reform, and perhaps reflecting their previous experience, not believe that they will be adequately compensated through redistribution. But sometimes a majority of the public opposes policies that the majority would likely gain from. This may in part be due to lack of understanding of the nature of economic policies, choices among the general public. It may due to uncertainty over who will likely gain or lose from the policy. It is easy to understand that if voters are risk averse, they may oppose a policy if they see a risk that they may turn out to be among those who will lose from it. Raquel Fernandez and Danny Rodrigue, however, demonstrated why even risk-neutral voters may rationally vote against a policy from which a majority will benefit. The basic idea is that if a significant number, but still a minority, of voters know with certainty that they will gain from a policy, they will vote for the policy. But what of the majority who do not know? For example, most may be unsure what skills they will need in order to be successful in the still obscure post-reform environment, and therefore how competitive they can be. Suppose that these remaining voters can only estimate their chances of gaining. Even if the percentage of gainers is fully known, say 55% will gain, in many cases, if the uncertain voters estimate their chances of gaining as equal to that of the other uncertain voters, it will be rational to vote no. As a simple numerical example of this, status quo bias will illustrate. Institutions and path dependency. The framework suggested by Nobel laureate Douglas North is useful for understanding qualitative differences in policy formulation across the world or countries. North distinguishes between institutions and organizations. Institutions are formal and informal rules of the game or of the economic game. These are humanly devised constraints such as contract enforcement that define incentives for savings, investment, production, and trade. These in turn affect benefits and cost and economic behavior that may lead to development or decline. Following from this, organizations spring up around the property rights designed to help those who control the organization prosper under these existing property rights. Organizations emerge that are in large part defined and shaped by the incentives that emerge from these rules. In a widely cited quote, North says, if the institutional matrix rewards piracy, then only piratical organizations will come into existence. Once these inefficient rights are in place, there are generally no incentives for the people in power to change them, especially when these rights can provide leaders with greater private gains than an alternative regime that may be better for society as a whole. Thus, inefficient institutions continue at the expense of overall welfare or of growth. The market cannot guarantee the evolution of efficient institutions. This trap is an example of path dependency, a condition in which the past condition of an individual or economy affects future conditions. Democracy versus autocracy, which facilitates faster growth. The comparative merits of democratic or autocratic regimes for development performance, especially economic growth, have been much debated. These debates have presented some of the trade-offs starkly. Under democracy, politicians seeking re-election have an incentive. On the other hand, a looming election gives an incentive to pursue short-term accomplishments that can be pointed to during a campaign rather than what is necessary good for long-term development. Worse, the corrupt politician who knows he or she will soon to be voted out of office has an interest to steal as much as possible in the meantime. Under autocracy, there are fewer constraints on what can be stolen and for how long. But the politician who is reasonably confident of remaining in power for a long time, can pursue long term development strategies, at the very least, to have more to steal from. Jacob Dehan and Clement Sherman point out that despite the arguments and also some evidence in the literature of negative relationship between growth and democracy, such as studies report that a lack of civil and political liberties is also negatively correlated with growth. They propose using better measures of democracy, including how deeply rooted it has become in the society, suggesting a measure based on the number of years that a country can be regarded as a democracy. However, a widespread view is that democracy is good for broader development objectives such as equity, education, health, and famine prevention. Development roles of NGOs and the broader citizen sector. A wide range of organizations fall under the NGO banner. The United Nations Development Program defines an NGO as any profit voluntarily or voluntary citizens group which is organized on a local, national, or international level. Task-oriented and driven by people with a common interest, NGOs perform a variety of services and humanitarian functions, bring citizens' concerns to government, monitor policies, and encourage political participation at the community level. There are at least seven partially overlapping and mutually reinforcing types of organizational comparative advantage for international or national NGOs or local organizations, such as federations or of community-based organizations. These are illustrated with examples with the field of poverty alleviation. Number one is the innovation. NGOs can play a key role in the design and implementation of programs focused on poverty reduction and other development goals. For example, NGOs that work directly with the poor may design new and more effective programs that reach the poor, facilitated by this close working relationship. Number two, program flexibility. An NGO can address development issues that are viewed as important for the communities in which it works. In principle, an NGO is not constrained by the limits of public policy or other agendas, such as those of donor country, foreign assistance priorities, or by domestic, national, or local governmental programs. Number three is the specialized technical knowledge. National and international NGOs may be greater repositories of technical expertise and special knowledge than local governments or businesses. In particular, international NGOs can draw on the experiences of many countries that may offer possible models for problems of poverty faced by one country as well as possible solutions. Number four is the targeted local public goods. Goods and services that are rival but excludable, including those targeted to social excluded populations, may be the best designed and provided by the NGOs that know and work with these groups. Possible examples include local public health facilities, non-formal education, provision of specialized village telecommunications, and number five is the common property resource management design and implementation. NGOs, including federations of local CBOs, can play an important role in common property management and targeted local public good provisions. Throughout the developing world, both governments and the private sector have a poor track record in ensuring sustainability of forests, lakes, coastal fishing areas, pasture lands, and other common property resources, also known as commons. Number six is the trust and credibility. In practice, NGOs may have other advantages over government in gaining trust. and providing effective services to groups with special needs, notably those in extreme poverty. NGOs' local presence and relationships, frequent interactions and communication, and greater avenues for participation may generate greater trust among the poor and other citizens. Number seven, representation and advocacy. NGOs may hold advantages in understanding the needs of the poor, who otherwise are often excluded from political processes and even local community deliberations. NGOs may play a role in the aggregation of preferences and hence of representation of community needs. To the degree that NGOs have a better understanding of locally binding poverty traps, they should be in a position to represent the needs of the poor more effectively. This responsibility reflects the advocacy role of NGOs, including federations of CBOs, in advocating for the needs of poor and socially excluded peoples. The last topic is the trends in governance and reform. Tackling the problem of corruption. The elimination of corruption is important for development for several reasons. First of all, as just noted, honest government may promote growth and sustainable high incomes. In addition, the associations of eliminating corruption with public empowerment suggest that it is a direct objective of development. Corruption is the abuse of public trust for private gain, and it is a form of stealing. Indexes of corruption regularly rate the incidence of corruption far higher in developing countries than in developed countries. This is understood to reflect both cause and effect. An absence of corruption encourages investment and efforts to expand the pie rather than merely fight over its distribution, and thus encourages growth. To this extent, improvements in governance in general and reduction of corruption in particular could be means to accelerate the process of development. Finally, the effects of corruption fall disproportionately on the poor and are a major restraint on their ability to escape from poverty. Government participation. If the goal of economic growth is human development, then without participation, we could have economic growth without development. Indeed, participation, a say in development policies by the people most affected by them, is arguably in itself a chief end of development. Participation is also a means to further human capabilities and other goals of development as defined in Chapter 1. Moreover, economic growth is greatly facilitated by human development and impossible to sustain without it. Developer participation has been shown to make projects work better with genuine and full participation by beneficiaries on what projects are chosen, and in the way that development assistance gets used more generally, we should expect less corruption and greater development results per dollar of aid spent.